also generally very upstanding citizens. That was their whole shtick. They were holier than thou, basically. Even in a time when everyone was holier than thou, the Quakers were even more so. And Huddy did not really fit in with that type. Huddy was a troublemaker by almost all accounts from an early age, and he found himself going into debt early on, and even spending time in debtor's prison, which was very common in colonial society. Essentially, if you owed someone money, you would be sent to jail, and it was somehow you were expected to pay that money off by being in jail. It was never really clear, but it was something that was inherited from the British system. The people towards the bottom really had very little say, and the system was set up that way, where you could go to jail just by simply owing another private person money. So Huddy had to sell his 300-acre farm in Salem County and spend time in debtor's prison. And then, but that was his early life, and Huddy would eventually, even in his own lifetime, go on to become a folk hero while he was alive during the American Revolution, particularly in New Jersey and particularly in Monmouth County. Captain Huddy's personal life was somewhat complicated by basically all accounts and measures. He originally married a widow named Mary Borden in 1764 in Salem County, and with her he had two daughters named Elizabeth and Martha. Later on, after the war, his daughters would file a petition with the basically brand new federal government at the time, seeking recognition for their father's exploits during the war, and essentially asking for financial compensation for themselves, which is understandable in reality, because they were children during that time, and their father would have been away during the war, and there was not much of an official support system back then. So if you weren't tending your crops, then nobody was, essentially. So people not only suffered by fighting the war, they put their own fortunes on the line, and this is before insurance and all those other things that might account for that later on. But they were actually petitioned, essentially to an early version of the Veterans Administration, but were not granted any compensation benefits at the time. So after Mary Borden passed, Huddy relocated to Monmouth County, and he to Colts Neck, or what is now Colts Neck, and he married another widow named Catherine Applegate Hart, who herself was, she was a Protestant like Huddy, but she had been married to a Jewish merchant named Levi Hart, who had owned the Colts Neck Inn, which is still in existence today in Colts Neck. As the husband, Huddy essentially more or less inherited that business and more or less took it over from his second wife, which was normal for the time, Catherine Applegate, and also he was accused of essentially more or less forcing her adult children, out of the family home at the time. Catherine's family would eventually sue Huddy for that. So this is just a few decades after people were, battling the Indians for their land and their territory, and people are already suing each other for civil matters in Monmouth County, which is interesting. So Huddy was fairly unscrupulous in a way, at least by the Applegate family's accounts, and how he treated her adult children. Of course, everyone's side of the story would be different, just as it would be today. This was in what is now called the Scoobyville section, I'm sorry, of Colts Neck, which was later called Atlantic Township before it was renamed to the Colts Neck. So Captain Huddy the pirate. So in addition to serving in the militia, Huddy also eventually obtained a letter of marque, which is the term used essentially for legalized piracy. And it was a very common practice in the 18th century and earlier. Even in well-established countries such as England and France would not necessarily maintain navies to the size that they would need during wartime and peacetime. So it was very common to, once a war started, which between England and France pretty much happened about every 20 years or so for about 200 years, they would issue letters of marque to private vessels to essentially say, okay, you now are legally allowed to be a pirate until the war ends or until otherwise noted, as long as you prey on enemy shipping. So the United States was heavily reliant on that because the United States Navy was incredibly small, especially compared to the British Navy, which was by far the largest and best trained and most experienced Navy in the world during the Revolution. Even France's Navy was really not much compared to the British Navy. So the United States and individual states or colonies would actually issue letters of marque. And Huddy was issued a letter of marque as a privateer, and he captained a small vessel called the Black Snake, which was a whaling boat, which all along the northeast and the colonies, whaling was a very common trade, particularly in New England. And whaling boats were small. They could go into rivers because they were very shallow draft vessels, and they could be used to, essentially sneak up on and board larger merchant vessels. It wasn't the kind of boat you would attack a British man-of-war with and hope to survive, but you could prey on British or pro-British shipping, which New York was controlled by the British essentially through the entire Revolutionary War. So and it was still a major merchant port as it is today. So ships were constantly going in and out of New York City, and American privateers would prey on those vessels in hopes of capturing and selling the cargo. That essentially, they were actually pirates. They were just pirates with a cause. So the Huddy's vessel had a 14-man crew and would attack vessels through generally the later part of the American Revolution in the New York, New Jersey area. It was armed with a swivel gun, as you can see here, which is a relatively small muzzle-loading cannon, as in you would, insert a solid shot iron ball into the muzzle and a charge of gunpowder, and you would literally just swivel it. One man could operate it and fire it. It was enough to convince merchant ships to surrender, but it wasn't something you're going to sink an enemy ship with. So it was, about the most firepower the Black Snake could hope to maintain. Okay, so in addition to serving as a Patriot privateer, Huddy also served in the militia, at times as captain of artillery in the Monmouth County Militia. So Huddy was, in 1777, Huddy participated in the Battle of Germantown in Pennsylvania in October, where the American forces led by George Washington were defeated by the British as they were trying to keep the British Army from seizing Philadelphia. This was still fairly early on in the war, 1777 generally being considered the worst year of the war for the American side. They were still very much outclassed by the British, man for man. Overall, the Americans, throughout the war, the Americans actually outnumbered the British. But at any given battle, the British often outnumbered the Americans, because the British Army had to stay together, and they basically had to follow orders. Whereas the Americans, much of the American forces was made up by militia who did not have to and generally would not leave their own state. So if you were fighting the British in New Jersey, once you crossed over to Pennsylvania, you would lose all those New Jersey militia guys. The Continental Army, meaning America's professional army, was different. They were trained more to the standards of the British Army, being modeled after them directly, but they were only a fraction of the American forces. And in any given battle, the British, along with Hessian and other German mercenaries who were also very well trained and respected for their fighting ability, were also bolstered by loyalist militia. As much as 1/5 of the American population was considered loyalist during the American Revolution, so it was certainly not as simple as the Americans versus the British. There was pro-British elements in every state in the colonies, some more than others. The South was generally more split 50-50, whereas New England was very heavily patriot-sided, and the Mid-Atlantic, New Jersey, New York was also somewhat divided. New Jersey, particularly Monmouth County, having large loyalist elements. Huddy also participated in the Battle of Monmouth. He was a leader of the Monmouth County militia there, this being the largest direct land battle of the American Revolution. In terms of the number of troops involved, approximately 13,000 British and 12,000 Patriot forces. What made Monmouth significant was this was the first time that the Americans truly stood toe-to-toe against the British Army in a relatively even battle in an open field in the European style of warfare. This being after their winter at Valley Forge, which was by all accounts a terrible winter, and then also after they had received training from Baron von Steuben, the soldier who had served in the Prussian army and then was brought over by Washington to serve as essentially a master drill master for the Continental Army. So this was after that winter of heavy training from von Steuben, who was famous for probably having lied on his resume. He advertised himself as the Field Marshal von Steuben, as in like the highest general you can be, whereas in reality he probably never made it above Hauptmann, which is captain, which is not that big of a deal for officers. But nevertheless, he was a capable officer, a capable drill instructor, and he did mold the Army into a capable fighting force. And at Monmouth, they proved their ability to fight the British, and this was without any help from the French, as they would receive later on. This was just the Americans fighting against not only British regulars, but by chance some of the best units in the British Army, including like the 78 Highlanders and the German Jaeger regiments, which were riflemen. They didn't carry muskets; they carried rifles, which were much more accurate, and they were trained to fight more in the style of what we think of the Americans fighting it, as running around and hiding behind things and making well-placed shots. The British and the Germans also did that. They weren't all strictly standing in lines. The British particularly had learned their lesson from the French Indian War, where they had largely been still fighting in that strict European manner, and they had suffered several big defeats from the French early on. And by the American Revolution, they really had learned their lesson and were fighting more, more maneuver warfare, more what we think of as modern warfare. They weren't just standing in lines. But then again, they also did do that when appropriate. And that actually was very effective because it was very hard to control people back then. There were no radios. So everyone had to be bunched tightly together in order to have the commanders have any control over the battle. So they would have to, do so through audible drums. That's what the drums were for. They weren't just for show. They were for communicating messages to the field armies. And generally, when you were fighting in that linear tactics of battle, the side that would just could stand there longest and slug it out would win and take the punishment. And the British were very good at doing that. Whereas the Americans, particularly the militia, would do it for a while, and then they would melt away and retreat, because they were not trained to the level that the British were. Okay. So also, besides participating in Germantown, Huddy participated in the Battle of Monmouth, and particularly after the Battle of Monmouth, he was known to have harassed the British on their way back from Freehold to Sandy Hook, where they eventually disembarked on ships back to New York City and Staten Island, which were British strongholds and would remain British strongholds throughout the war. So he was one of the commanders who harassed them after the major battle on the retreat back east. This was the typical of what we think of as a small-scale combat that characterized the war, particularly in New Jersey and Monmouth County. Monmouth being a major battle, but most of the other battles were really what we would call skirmishes, where only a few people may have been killed or wounded on either side. It was typical for the Americans to ambush British foraging parties or scouting parties, armies. Even organized armies like the British and the French typically did not carry all the food they would need for a campaign. They would go from town to town and basically just take what they needed from local farmers. Even in Europe, that was common practice, because this was before canned food and before locomotives and
MREs.
yes, before MREs, of course, and it was just common practice. It was the way war was done. And they would do that. The Americans would also do the same thing. They would forage from local populations, friendly or otherwise, and they would just take what they needed, and that was just the way it was done, because there really was no other way for the army to feed itself. Another wartime exploit was Joshua Huddy's battle with Colonel Ty. So in September of 1780, this was later on, Loyalist forces, including members of what was known as the Black Brigade, which was commanded by Colonel Titus Ty. He was an escaped slave from Monmouth County, who had made his way down to Virginia, which was a feat in and of itself during that time, let alone for an escaped slave, let alone during a war. And he had joined the royal governor, pro-British governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, through the Dunmore Proclamation, had issued orders to form a regiment of freed slaves who would serve the British side and would theoretically be granted their freedom after the war for their service. So, also known as Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. Ethiopian just being a general term for Africans at the time. They weren't actually from Ethiopia. They were from mostly Virginia. So he actually had joined that regiment and then made his way back to New Jersey, which is also amazing. And he eventually became a leader of a group of escaped slaves as well as white loyalist fighters. Ty was literally fighting for his freedom in the most literal sense of the word. Not that the Patriots weren't also doing that, but they weren't slaves. So Colonel Ty had allegedly participated in the Battle of Monmouth, of course on the British side, and was aware of Huddy and his exploits and was specifically sent to capture him. So he and a group of Loyalist forces laid siege to Huddy's home in Colts Neck. Huddy managed to fend off the attackers with only the aid of his servant, Lucretia Emmons. Huddy was essentially purposely moving from window to window on his second floor of his home, shooting multiple muskets at the attackers in order to make it seem like there was more defenders than there really were. And Lucretia was helping him by reloading his muskets while he was doing that. And he did actually cause some casualties, including wounding Colonel Ty himself. Ty was not officially a colonel in the British Army, but he was given it as an honorary title because he was recognized that he was a capable leader of men, even though he had not had a real commission, which would have been impossible at that time. But he was the leader of that loyalist group, and he was wounded in the wrist during the battle with Huddy, and he would eventually die of those wounds from gangrene shortly thereafter the battle. But the loyalists managed to set Huddy's home on fire, and then Huddy essentially agreed to surrender at that time under the condition that they would allow the servant to leave, which they did, and they actually extinguished the fire, which is part of their truce. It's always amazing when you hear some of those very specific, very personal things during the war, as in they didn't just burn it down, they said, okay, we'll put the fire out as long as you come out, and that's what he did. So he was captured, and he was going to be transported. The plan was to transport him back to New York for trial and most likely execution, or most likely imprisonment and then execution. Let's see. Okay. So for this one, Huddy did manage to escape his captivity at the time. He was being transported to Sandy Hook by Colonel Ty's men in open canoes, and they were fallen upon by local patriot militia, including a cannon, actually, and they fired upon them while they were traversing the river in their canoes, and they inflicted some casualties on the loyalists, and Huddy himself was actually wounded, possibly by the patriots, in the thigh, but he did manage to escape the canoe and swim to safety, and did recover from his wound. So he went on to live to fight another day, and 6 loyalists were actually killed in this action, where they were ambushed while traversing the river, which was very vulnerable for them, of course.
They believe that was by where the bridge goes from Middletown to Seabrand, right?
Yes, I believe so. Yes. And if anyone has any questions, or like exactly, because I couldn't think of that detail in my head. If anyone has any thoughts or interjections, you don't have to wait. Raise your hand, and we'll go right in. Yes.
What did you say?
Oh, you said it was by the Seabright?
Highlands, and I was thrilled when I learned that really cool piece of history with him making their escape was right there. The bridge from Rumson over to Seabright, they believed that it was right around there that Huddy escaped, and that they were, and the Patriot fired, I guess, up from the Rumson side of Shrewsbury at the British, and that helped give him cover to
Yes.
jump into the river and swim to sea.
Yes, exactly. And
With the wounded guy.
yes, and and this was, of course, even 100 years later, being wounded was usually pretty much a death sentence, long before penicillin or modern surgery or anything like that. So just being wounded while swimming and surviving is amazing, and also being able to make it to safety and then continue fighting later on in the war. Yes.
Did Huddy live in the Colts Neck Inn?
He lived, his actual home was essentially right across the street from it.
Oh.
The Colts Neck Inn is still there, and the foundation of his home is still visible, but the home itself is, it's like an empty lot. But you can see, the actual foundation of his original home. And, but the Colts Neck Inn is the Colts Neck Inn that he had run for a time as a tavern keeper.
The story must have done some digs there, right?
I believe so. Back, a lot of things were done during like the bicentennial period. I'm not aware of anything lately, but they do know, I believe there was a marker there, like a historic road marker, because it's not very obvious because there's no building there, but you can find it if you look for it. And it's pretty cool. Let's see. So at another time, Huddy participated in the execution of Stephen Edwards, who was a local man accused of being a spy for the British. Huddy and other patriots, this was an example of, there was a lot of very low level, very personal fighting, it really would appear more as a kidnapping or a murder than a battle, really, in reality, between, individuals and individual families and groups of friends during the Revolution in Monmouth County, because these people lived next door to people who may have been on the other side of the aisle politically during the war. And people also had shifting sentiments. If the British Army was coming, there's a good chance someone who was on the fence may decide that it's time to join the Loyalist cause. And conversely, with the Patriots, if people did what was best suited for them at the time, it wasn't always a 100% commitment to one side for the entire war. Most people were just simply farmers trying to survive, and which was hard enough at the time. So they had to take all that into consideration. So Edwards was a local man who was captured with written orders from a prominent Loyalist Colonel Edward Taylor, who was a Middletown resident. There's a Taylor Butler home on Kings Highway, which was his family home. The same Edward Taylor family was also involved, likely with the killing of another local patriot, Joseph Murray of Middletown, where the Murray farmhouse still stands today. It was likely that men who worked for the Taylors, who were, Loyalist local leaders had sent men over to kill Murray at his farmhouse. Murray having been another patriot who had particularly had stolen horses or confiscated horses from the Taylor family for service in the Continental Army. So obviously they didn't like that, so he sent men who worked for him, most likely, and had Murray really more assassinated, essentially. Which seems silly to think of assassinating a local farmer, but that's what it was. And then there was a reprisal killing. One of those men, or one of the likely suspects, was killed by friends of Murray later on. So there was a lot of tit for tat, very localized, very personal, bitter fighting, particularly in Monmouth County, which was a mixed county when it came to loyalties. Partially because Monmouth County was pretty close to New York City. There was still, many farmers were dependent upon trade with merchants in New York. So if you were to sell your farm products, as a farmer, you had to sell it to merchants in New York, who would then sell it to, other places in the Caribbean, or, places that needed food, that were, other parts of the British Empire. So there was an economic reason to stay loyal to Britain, because otherwise you might not be able to sell your farm products. It may just rot in your farm, and you would not be able to make any money from your very hard work. So Stephen Edwards was the one who was accused of being a spy, the letter had ordered him to reconnoiter the area and estimate the strength of the local patriot forces in the area. So he was captured, and the letter was found, and Huddy and others strung him up and executed him, essentially there at the spot, as a spy, because he was not a uniformed British soldier. So that was something that would eventually come back to haunt Huddy. He was actually involved in several episodes like that. Okay, and then later on in 1782, Huddy was captured for a second time. He was leading a important defensive position in what is now Toms River, New Jersey, in Ocean County. At the time, Monmouth and Ocean County were all one county. They were all Monmouth County. They wasn't divided into two counties until much later. So in Toms River, he was commanding a blockhouse, which is essentially a small fortification that was built to defend a local salt works, which is where salt was gathered, which was very vital. It'd be like capturing an oil field today. It was needed because armies were so dependent on, salting meats, particularly salted pork was very common army food all the way up through the Civil War and beyond. So armies would need that salt to preserve the food that they did carry with them. So it was very important for the British to either capture or destroy the salt works at Toms River, which was controlled by the Patriots. So Huddy was, due to his earlier exploits in being a capable leader, was put in charge of the blockhouse, and he had 25 men defending it with him. But they were eventually attacked by British and pro-British loyalists, approximately numbering 80 men who laid siege to the blockhouse, and eventually Huddy was forced to surrender. And the local salt works was put to the torch by the pro-British forces. So after this, he was held prisoner. He was taken to a prison hulk in New York Harbor, and these were large vessels. Essentially, they were floating prisons. The British would take the mast off the vessel, like a ship that was otherwise almost useless, and they would turn it into a large floating prison that was hard to escape from because it was floating in the harbor. And it was generally considered a death sentence to be captured and sent to these prison barges or prison hulks. It was actually more Americans died as prisoners in these floating prison hulks than actually died on the battlefield during the American Revolution. So you were better off not getting captured than you were getting captured and being sent to a prison barge, because they were so cramped and dark and disease-ridden, and food was scarce, of course, because feeding your prisoners was not a priority in the 18th century.
What bread you got from the stick?
Yes, I'm sure it was filled with maggots or weevils and all that stuff. So Huddy was interned in one of those prison barges for a time. Also, it's interesting, during the Revolution, individuals would be captured and released almost seemingly at random. It wasn't like, oh, you're captured and that's the end of it. Like Joseph Murray, the other patriot we spoke about earlier, he had been captured and interned in a prison barge and released at some point and literally walked home to Middletown over the frozen New York Harbor, which is, it shows you how much colder it got back then that was even possible. And that is, by all accounts, is what he actually did. So obviously the conditions on those ships must have been not great if the harbor was that frozen for that long. So Huddy was actually set to be released. He was going to be released from British custody and then turned over to loyalists led by another Monmouth County loyalist named Captain Richard Lippincott, who was going to make a prisoner exchange with the Americans for another pro-British prisoner, which was also a very common practice during the American Revolution. An officer of equal rank would be exchanged for another officer of equal rank, as like a gentleman's agreement type thing during the 18th century. So ostensibly they were going to, we're going to take him and we're going to exchange him. These were the American loyalists who were taking from the actual British, but they had other intentions, and they were planning on hanging him, which they did. So actually, He was taken from the prison barge and taken to Middletown Point, as it's known, which is actually now on Sandy Hook, which was actually an island at the time. Sandy Hook is now a peninsula, but due to changing winds and sand and erosion patterns, it was an island during the American Revolution. So he was taken there and he was hanged on April 12th, 1782. And this was a year, almost a year after Battle of Yorktown. So the American Revolution was still on, but land battles had largely stopped by this point. But the British were still in New York City, so it was kind of like a weird gray area. There wasn't a whole lot of fighting going on, but the British were still here and there was still technically a war on. So he was executed without a trial, and then he was later buried at Old Tenant Church, Presbyterian Church in Manalapan, where you can visit his grave today. It's marked there. Presbyterians were largely of Scottish descent and were largely patriots during the war, whereas many Americans who were strictly of English or more recent English immigrants tended to be more loyalists. Whereas the Scots or other, Dutch or French or Irish Americans in the colonies had less loyalty to England. But many of the leaders in the American Revolution were English, such as Jefferson and Franklin and Washington. But in general, that was kind of the split. So Huddy was executed, and this was in large part due to his own execution earlier of Stephen Edwards, as well as his role in the execution of another loyalist named Philip White, another local man who Huddy and his men had executed by hanging. And particularly, he was strung up with a sign on him, allegedly indicating "Up goes Huddy for Philip White," as in, an eye for an eye type of thing. So that shows you the personal nature of it. These were friends of that guy who had held a grudge against Huddy for what he had done earlier in the war.
Apparently, you met his great court.
Yes, yeah. Huddy was, could have been accused of being a scoundrel in some ways in the treatment of his stepchildren, and possibly his second wife, but he was certainly no coward by any measure, including by accounts from the British and other loyalists who had faced him. And a particularly capable leader, which is why he was, sent relatively far away down the Thames River to command the salt works there. Captain Richard Lippincott, who was the leader of the party that had actually executed Huddy, was also involved in another incident in Shrewsbury, New Jersey. He had been the leader of another loyalist group that attacked what is known as the Allen House in Shrewsbury, which was in 1778, or 1779, I'm sorry, but that was actually occupied by Continental forces, American official Continental forces. Essentially, they were an occupying force because Monmouth County was a troublesome area for the American Patriot government. So they brought in Continentals from Virginia who had no particular loyalty to the people who lived here, as in they wouldn't give them a free pass if they found out their cousin or their neighbor was trading with the British in New York. So this essentially outside force was occupying the area, the Allen House, and Richard Lippincott and his men attacked the Allen House and ended up killing 3 of the Continental soldiers stationed there. Just as a reference, the same characters show up again and again in local history during the American Revolution.
Monmouth County Historical Association just this past Thursday evening.
Yes.
Presentation on the Allen
Yes, and that is a very cool historic site that you can go and tour. It's interesting because It was also a tavern, as well as a boarding house or hotel, which most taverns were back then. And it was also the local, it was the site used for local magistrates or judges. So it was kind of an all-purpose building, which is very common in colonial America. Yes?
Where is it?
This is on, it's,
The northwest corner?
yes.
Sycamore Avenue, 330.
Sycamore? and-
Exactly, the corner of Sycamore. There's also a historic Episcopal church there, which is from 1702, and right next door to it is the Allen House, which is probably even older, probably 1690s, so
And
it's a
the
cool
Quaker
spot.
Meeting House, and then the Shrewsbury Town Hall.
Yes. Let's see. So actually, after Huddy was executed, it actually became almost a scandal during the war. Even though the war was still happening, it was like treated as a separate, hey, this is outside the normal rules of war type of a thing. Because he was executed without a trial, which was not typically done. The British really didn't hang that many people. I enjoy the movie The Patriot with Mel Gibson, but the British are really portrayed as worse than the Nazis, burning down churches full of civilians for no reason. It really didn't happen. Huddy is, I believe, one of 2 people who were officially hung by the British, and even then it was actually Americans who did it. It wasn't even the British government per se. Their intention was to keep colonies as part of the British Empire. They weren't trying to burn everything and salt the earth. They thought of them as misguided cousins who they wanted to keep as part of the empire, not to do as much damage as they could. He was officially hung by the British, and I can't think of any other individuals who was officially hung by the British government. Hale being the most famous one. Yes. He was executed by the British Army itself as a spy. So Washington took notice of this, General Washington, and he actually threatened to hang a captured British officer in retaliation for Huddy's execution. And they had picked a man through a lottery, Captain Charles Assagill. So it was known as the Assagill Affair. So this was meant to be a tit for tat. We'll hang one of your guys if you're going to hang one of our guys. And the crisis was averted. Actually, the French Foreign Minister, Comte de Vegri, managed to talk Washington out of it because it was considered ungentlemanly, unscrupulous, and would only lead to further retaliation from the British, which is probably true. So he was probably correct in sparing Captain Assagill, who had really nothing to do with it.
And if they weren't negotiating the treaty in Paris yet, they soon would.
Yes. It was also, and let's not derail peace talks with the British over one guy being hanged, was the idea. So let's advance here. And this is an image, a fairly famous drawing of Huddy being let out of his imprisonment in New York before he was brought to New Jersey, where he was eventually executed. Let's see here. This is an image, I didn't discuss this, of the blockhouse fight itself, where they, you can visit, it's not, it's a very, almost a miniature version of the blockhouse. It's there's a wooden palisade that's about this tall in Tom's River, but it's meant to represent a larger fortification that was there. But it gives you the idea of it, even though it's not really to scale.
I remember driving near that one time, and I don't remember any elevated land like this.
Oh, yeah. I mean, images were very often inaccurate. Yes, so, things were images were drawn very often years after the fact, based on a letter written by a guy who wrote the letter years after the fact. So, there's, even if it's from the general time period, there's no guarantee of images being accurate. And usually the person writing it had a political motive for writing whatever he was writing. as in making it look a certain way.
A great example is Longfellow's poem about Paul Revere, and that was 50 years afterwards.
Right, yes.
And he's got him yelling, the British are coming, the British are coming. He almost certainly didn't say that because this is even before the Declaration of Independence.
Exactly.
And the people in Massachusetts would have, well, hey, we're British too.
Exactly. Especially in the beginning of the war, Americans, even the ardent patriots, saw themselves as British subjects. And they saw themselves as Englishmen who were living under English law, which was already the most liberal form of government in Europe. The British were not tyrannical compared to the French or the Spanish or the Prussians or the Russians. They were already the most progressive country going.
All had absolute monarchies or pretty.
Yes, the British had killed their own king 100 years before this in the English Civil War. So the British had already made their own reforms. But by the American Revolution, the British living in America felt that the current Parliament was not living up to the rules that they had already were supposed to be living by. As in, we're not supposed to be taxed unless we are represented in Parliament. And the colonies were not represented in Parliament. That was already English law. So they were just saying, hey, just play by the rules that you are already supposed to play by. And in reality, if the British had consented and allowed them to be represented, they would have been outvoted anyway, because Britain had 9 million people and the colonies had 3 million. So in a way, they should have just said, sure, we'll let you be represented and we'll vote you down every turn anyway. And then they couldn't say anything, but that's not how it worked out. So like this image here, Huddy is in the center there, obviously made to look very heroic, standing tall, well dressed, facing his impending death. Okay. So Huddy's legacy. Huddy was a very complex individual, and he himself had been kicked out of the Friends, or the community of Friends, the Quakers church, earlier in his life for having personal flaws and debts and conflicts with people and drinking and all those typical type of things you would imagine someone like Huddy would be doing. He wasn't cut out to be a Quaker, but that's the community he was born into. So he had been, essentially excommunicated by the Quakers, who largely remained pacifist during the war. Did not, even though they tended to be more English, they did not fight on the British side, because their religion called for peace above anything else. He was a notably brave and competent soldier, artilleryman, and privateer, and particularly a good leader of men. And he stood out in a time when there was many great men such as that. And some of the local things that bear his name are Joshua Huddy Park in Tom's River, which is where the Black House is represented, as well as in Colts Neck, several things. There's Huddy's Inn restaurant, which is a current modern day restaurant. It's not located on the site of anything particularly, but it is it's decorated in a colonial style and pretty cool to go into. Lots of colonial paintings and imagery. The Colts Neck Inn, which was Huddy's tavern for a time, is still present and standing in Colts Neck. And numerous other streets and roads. Joshua Huddy Road in Colts Neck also bears his name. The Ocean County chapter, because part of his battles took place in what is now Ocean County, also bears the Daughters of the American Revolution. It was also named after Captain Joshua Huddy. So he was one of the most famous individuals who served during the Revolution and died during the Revolution in our area. Does anyone have any other questions or thoughts? Yes?
Where did you do what were your sources for most of your research?
Actually, I spent a good amount of time at the Monmouth County Historical Association in Freehold, which is,
That white building, White House across the street from the courthouse?
yes, on Court Street, I believe it's called. That's generally open to the public. You don't need anything special to go there. They have the actual, physical archive that you can take out and look at, which is pretty cool. Also, from a lot of online research, like the New Jersey Journal of the American Revolution, and also various other sources from the Sons of the American Revolution. But also just going to these locations themselves and just observing, the Battle of Monmouth, as well as the Black House and other locations. There's neat little signs and little parks all over the place. Most of the time you don't even notice them unless you're looking for them. Sometimes they're kind of hidden or overgrown or in not very well traveled areas, but they are out there. Probably more regarding him than any other individual in this immediate area.
I
Yes.
see that I was a resident of Highlands for several years and came under its influence. But I wouldn't say they insist, but they have a park and they have a marker.
Yes.
Where they say he was hanged by the loyalists.
Yes.
Right by the water. It is by the water, and of course you can look over and see Sandy Hook, and if you're a good swimmer, you can swim over there. But they say it was there where there's a gazebo in Huddy Park.
Yes.
In the downtown islands.
Right.
And they say that, and the park is named for him.
Yes.
He was hanged there. I mean, I was a New York City tour guide for 10 years, and there are 3 different sites in Manhattan, far apart. where They
Yes.
say Nathan Hale was hanged,
Oh,
so
sure.
God knows.
Yeah. So, things were not necessarily recorded
Yeah.
at the time because, the guys who hanged him, after they hanged him, they wanted to get out of there, essentially, because they were in, essentially rebel territory with, his friends likely coming after them. So, they would, once they did the thing, they would leave. Things were not particularly documented because you didn't know you want to be associated necessarily and then have yourself hang later for it. We do know he was hanged, and he was in retaliation for his earlier hangings of Philip White and Stephen Edwards, among other things. Also being a pirate, which is reason enough in times of peace or war. Any other questions or thoughts?
He had second children.
The 2 natural children that I'm aware of were Elizabeth and Martha from his first wife, Gordon. His stepchildren, I can't recall their names at this time, but they were.
Be a soldier.
Yeah. Right. It's very possible from everything we've seen and read, it wouldn't be shocking for him to have children elsewhere, to be that type of guy, basically. So that is very possible, but I haven't come across it specifically. But it's certainly, if anything, I would say it's likely, given the time period. And him,
His age.
yes, exactly. He was not the Quaker type. But he was a ardent patriot, a capable leader who did, die directly for the patriot cause during the war. And for that alone, he should be remembered. If anyone has any other questions.
How old was he when he was executed?
He was born in 35. He was executed in 82, so 47. At most 47. Which was, people didn't live as long back then, but it's somewhat misleading when they say, oh, people only live to be, 20 or 30, because it depends on how you look at that, because so many people died so young, the average life expectancy was much shorter. But, there are people like Ben Franklin who lived to be well into his 80s, and as, you know, as well as many other individuals. So it's somewhat skewed. You know, there are plenty of people who lived a long time.
Maybe to the 90 mark.
I believe so, upper 80s, 90s. Of course, he was wealthy, which helps at any time period.
I knew I understood science.
Yes, exactly, yes. But, you know, Huddy was, you know, given his lifestyle, he probably wasn't the type to live super long, given his cantankerous nature, but he did, you know, he was hanged, you know, as a patriot specifically for deeds he had done for the American Revolution. That's my presentation. And if anyone, you know, feel free to take the paper home with you if you'd like. It may not match exactly what I have on there because I have several iterations. You know, we'll hopefully be doing another presentation again at some point in the future. And you know, I encourage anyone to just Google Sons of the American Revolution, Monmouth County chapter. If anyone thinks they might be appropriate or have a friend who's interested in joining, they're always looking for new members. But that's it. So thank you.